Virtually, virtually everything we hear in the Western mainstream media can be traced regarding Syria and the subject of terrorism in general, particularly where it concerns ISIS, of the so-called uh, what do you call it? The caliphate, the connection between ISIS and Daesh and Al Qaeda and Al Nusra, and all these various acronyms that we come up with. All of what we hear, virtually in all media outlets here in the West, are based on two sources, or rather three sources. One source is obviously the American government and its viewpoint regarding the situation. One very other prominent source, particularly where it concerns terrorism, terrorist networks, videos, decapitation videos of journalists and so on, are based on number one, an outfit called SITE, S-I-T-E, which is presumably has connections to Israeli intelligence. This is an outfit run by Rita Katz, who is a refugee from Iraq, with the background for working in the Israeli army and so on. And so it's not exactly a neutral source as far as I'm concerned, particularly the videos that are constantly being put out there, which then the American audience is being told, no, you shouldn't watch those. And when capitations actually didn't take place in those videos, if you've ever watched any of them full length, this is another matter. These are essentially propaganda videos that this outfit says are coming from ISIS or the various terrorist factions in the Middle East, when in actuality they're more likely staged by various intelligence agencies, Western-based intelligence agencies, mainly for propaganda purposes, which is not to say that these radical Islamist factions aren't creating havoc in the Middle East. But what's always left out, of course, is that the West itself is actually instrumental in propagating and supporting some of these rebels, so to speak, when they can work to the benefit of Western powers, or in conjunction, or sometimes not in conjunction, with Middle Eastern regional powers such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar. The other outlet that you will constantly hear mentioned, and people tend to glance over this, is the Syrian, the human, what is it called? The Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, which is basically a one-man outfit based in the UK, and everything that the so-called Western-supported rebels want to get out there to the Western public is decimated, or is it not decimated, but propagated through this outfit on a continuous basis, with nobody even questioning, or actually some outlets have, but very few in between, without anybody questioning what are why are we getting this so-called intelligence from mainly two sources. So, well, without me getting too riled up about it, but this is the context of things, and this is why you cannot believe everything that you hear, either in the mainstream media or, for that matter, in the alternative media, because even the alternative media is now being massively undermined by all of this propaganda, to where sometimes, you just need to take a time out and say, enough of this. I'm not gonna spend all my time online. I'm gonna think about this situation, see where this information comes from, do some reading, some actual reading of books, not spend so much time on the internet, and gain a renewed, sustained perspective on, you know, how history is shaped, how great powers shape world power relationships. So here then is George Friedman and his latest essay. George Friedman is essentially the head of Stratfor, which is an analyst kind of think tank, very close to the American foreign policy power structure. They advise both governments and corporations, business entities. They're not designed to inform the American people, so to speak, or any people for that matter. It is strictly, although it's all out there, they don't make a secret about it or anything. It's all out there, but of course very few people have the time to actually read this, to spend time with it, to do their own analysis of these perspectives, so to speak. But here it is so that you can see what the elite players in American foreign policy are actually thinking. So the article was published in September of 2015 by the Stratfor site. You can read it on your own. It's for free. It doesn't cost you anything. Which pertains to the relationship of Russia, US, Syria. So George Friedman says, Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to the United States next week will put his political strategy in Syria to the test. Putin is looking to re-engage with the global power brokers that have been punishing his country since 2014. And he's betting that a strong role in Syria will buy him leverage at the negotiating table. On the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York, where he is set to give a speech September 28th, that's, let's see, 2 days from now, Putin will try out his newfound bargaining power in a meeting with US President Barack Obama. So from the very outset, Friedman is saying that Putin is re-engaging with global power brokers. So presumably he means the West and the Middle East. Because let's be frank about this, Putin has had meetings with the Sisi regime in Egypt, which is probably one of the most repressive regimes in the Middle East, on par with Saudi Arabia. So he is making overtures, military deals with that country. So, you know, I'm looking at this I'm trying to look at this from all perspectives. So, but somehow Putin is wrong when he does this, but the Americans are not wrong when we've done the same thing. This is where this whole hypocritical thinking comes in. So the sit down will be the sit down will be two presidents' first meeting on U.S. or Russia on Russian soil since Putin's 2012 return to the presidency. The top issue will be a Russian proposal for the conflict in Syria, which seeks to coordinate ongoing U.S. efforts with Russia's stepped-up operations in a way that recognizes the role of forces of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in the campaign against the Islamic State. However, Moscow has included a crucial concession in the potential agreement that conforms to a key U.S. demand, a political transition away from the current government. In other words, Friedman makes it seem as if Putin is the one who's making the concession, when in reality, everybody wants Assad out. Assad actually never wanted that power to start with, but this is besides the point. Assad was American educated. He really didn't want to have anything to do with his father's power structure. He would have rather remained as an optometrist in the UK or wherever else he was working. But family relations being as they are in the Middle East, he was basically pressed into that position. And he has used that power both for good and bad in his own country. So Friedman comes from the perspective, he says, well, you know, Putin is now making leeway to perhaps get Assad out of power. You know, this gives the United States, of course, some face-saving capability in Friedman's eyes, at least. According to reports in the US media citing anonymous Russian sources, Moscow is prepared to move forward with a unilateral campaign against the Islamic State if the United States does not cooperate. Leaks to Russian media outlets like Kommersant and Novaya Gazeta suggest that Russia might do so while Putin is in New York. In other words, some sort of a surprise element here, which is ridiculous if it's being portrayed here. So perhaps during his UN speech, you know, as if the General Assembly in the UN had any power to begin with. That's the suggestion here. In any case, I'm not going to, you know, read the whole article. Russian operations, Friedman says, Russian operations against the Islamic State would likely take place in several places across Syria. In Homs, Russian forces could support a government counteroffensive, in other words, Assad's government, counteroffensive against the Islamic State, the Islamic State held city of Palmyra. An intervention could also support the besieged Syrian 104th Republican Brigade in Deir el-Sur, or the ongoing push towards Kirvar's airbase. The Russians are also likely to provide air support to Syrian loyalist forces fighting against non-Islamic State rebels. This is, of course, where it gets totally confusing. Then he goes on to say Russia's timing is deliberate. Moscow has purposely built up its position in Syria to coincide with Putin's visit. By intervening in the crisis, Russia wants to show that its standoff with the West over the Ukraine has neither isolated it or made it any less integral to the international system. Now, finally, there seems to be some reality seeping into Friedman's thinking here. Because no, Russia is not going to give up its own objectives. It's not a superpower. It doesn't claim to be a superpower. Friedman has already said this in his previous articles. So I am not sure why Friedman is so obsessed over continuing to insist that this American empire, rather than a more deliberate power-sharing scheme, could not work in terms of world politics. He, of course, dismisses Russia's concerns about Ukraine and Moscow. He says Moscow will take this opportunity to try to initiate talks over a host of other issues, including Ukraine, Western sanctions and NATO's expanding presence. The United States, however, has not indicated a desire to shift its position on these issues. On the contrary, Washington is lobbying the Europeans to maintain sanctions against Russia in spite of a relatively solid ceasefire in the Ukraine. And election compromise proposals from Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine and the meeting between Putin and Obama, Friedman says, will indicate whether the United States plans to stand firm on these issues or open the door for future negotiations. In other words, Friedman has now gone back on his own analysis, saying that, yeah, maybe we shouldn't project this kind of power over everything. And he's giving, in other words, he himself is now giving Putin a way out and the Obama administration a way out, which will be interesting to observe because evidently, I don't believe that George Friedman and any of these foreign policy outfits are genuinely interested in a true cooperation between European powers, namely Germany and France, and the more powerful economic powers in Europe, and their association with Russia. They don't want that because it simply poses a threat to the empire. And so Europeans, and especially Germans and the French, should be very, very careful on following American foreign policy objectives without question. This is very, very dangerous for Europe because if all you have to do is look at the nuclear weapons which are stationed in Europe to this day, and the alignment of Russia and their nuclear forces. Because you see, if it comes to any confrontation, particularly with tactical nuclear weapons, heaven forbid we should even talk about this, but that is a real possibility. I mean, Europe is now flying around with fully armed Eurofighters in the northern Baltic states. It is a very, very dangerous escalation. And since, other than strategic nuclear weapons, the big ones, the big nukes, essentially America is not in any danger. But with tactical nuclear weapons, and we're talking about mini nukes, but mini nukes, I mean, this is not a joke. Mini nukes are essentially the equivalent of the Hiroshima bomb, Nagasaki bomb, and much bigger, actually. They're not intercontinental missiles, but they're equally as damaging. And this war, if it comes to one, is going to be fought on the European continent. I cannot imagine a more irresponsible policy on the part of Germans, particularly the German government, that is naive enough to believe, after their own foreign policy establishment, in close connection with the Americans, everything out in the open, and all these policy papers are basically telling the Europeans that our alliances are going to shift. Friends may not always be friends in the future. If they do not see this as a as a threat to their own existence. Europe as a whole, in particular Germany and the UK, needs to distance itself from United States foreign policy, because this policy is not necessarily in their own interest. You don't have to become enemies with the Americans. I'm just saying, develop some independent foreign policy, because this is, in the end, if any war begins or is fought, it's going to take place in Europe. And Europe, you would think, knows better. They've gone through enough mayhem and wars during the last century. The populations of Europe have to oppose these aggressive policies by either of these powers. But especially now, the aggressive power of the United States, which will, in order to maintain its dominance, not stop at this divide and conquer technique. It's very dangerous for the world. It's really, really dangerous.